The pre-ceremony gathering was supposed to be a calm, private preparation. Ladies-in-waiting, adjusting final details, the quiet confidence of women who had done this many times before settling over the room like something familiar and safe. But in one silent instant, Catherine looked at the tiara in Camilla's hands and understood what had happened. The request had not been a request. It had been a pressure. And the tiara now resting against Camilla's fingers had been Catherine's to wear that evening. Chosen, prepared, and placed in the dressing room before Camilla had arrived and changed everything. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. A royal tiara is not simply jewelry inside the monarchy's internal architecture. To understand why what happened in that dressing room produced the response it produced. From Catherine, from the staff who witnessed it, and ultimately from Anne, whose response would become the morning's defining event. It is necessary to understand what tiaras represent inside the institution's most carefully maintained symbolic language. Tiaras, within the British royal family, occupy a category of object that sits at the intersection of personal identity and institutional authority. They are not interchangeable accessories. They are not chosen according to the aesthetic preferences of the occasion in the way that other jewelry might be chosen. Each significant tiara within the royal collection carries a history that is specific, documented, and understood within the family as part of the object's identity as much as its physical properties. Who has worn it? On what occasions? What it has come to represent through the accumulation of those occasions into a pattern that gives the object its meaning beyond its material existence. The tiara Catherine had chosen for the evening was not the most famous in the royal collection. It was not something the public would have recognized from a coronation broadcast or a commemorative exhibition. But within the family, within the private sphere where the collection's emotional and symbolic dimensions were most fully understood, it carried a significance that was both precise and personal. It had been associated with Catherine through a series of significant occasions across her years within the family. It had come to be understood, through that association, as hers. Not in the legal sense of ownership, which was a more complicated question involving the distinction between personal and official royal property, but in the institutional sense of custodianship, of ongoing relationship, of the kind of understood connection that royal objects developed with the people who wore them with consistency and care. It had been placed in the dressing room before the pre-ceremony gathering began, prepared by the ladies-in-waiting whose role included exactly this kind of preparation. The careful arrangement of the objects that would be needed, positioned in the order and manner appropriate to how they would be used. Everything had been as it should be. The room had been arranged with the precision that significant royal occasions required, and then Camilla had arrived. The pre-ceremony gathering was small by design. Significant royal occasions required preparation periods that were protected from the kinds of pressures that larger gatherings produced, and the dressing room allocated for this particular preparation had been arranged to accommodate a specific and limited number of people. Catherine, her ladies-in-waiting. A senior dresser whose tenure with the royal household gave her the institutional knowledge that complex ceremonial preparation required. And, by arrangement that had been agreed in advance, Camilla, whose own preparation had been completed in a separate space, and who had come to the shared room for the final coordinating conversation that the occasion's requirements made appropriate. The transition from preparation to ceremony required a brief period of collective checking. A mutual confirmation that everything was in order, that the visual presentation of the senior royal women was coordinated in the ways the occasion required and complementary in the ways that aesthetic coherence demanded. It was a practical function dressed in the language of collegial warmth, and it was one of the small rituals that the institution had developed across years of managing the complexity of multiple senior women preparing simultaneously for high-visibility occasions. Camilla had entered the room with the composed confidence she brought to all ceremonial contexts. Her own preparation was complete. Her appearance was precisely what the occasion required. She moved through the initial pleasantries with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times and understood its choreography. And then her eyes had found the tiara. What passed across her face in the moment she identified the piece was something that the senior dresser, who had been in a position to observe it, would later describe with the careful precision of someone who understood that what she had seen was significant and that her account of it might matter. It was not admiration. Exactly. Not the aesthetic appreciation of a beautiful object seen in the context of a room prepared for important ceremony. It was something more purposeful than that, something that had a direction to it. Camilla had looked at the tiara, then she had looked at Catherine. Then she had said something that the dresser would also describe carefully, because the words themselves were less significant than the manner in which they had been delivered. She had said that she had always found that particular piece remarkable, that it had a quality that the occasion they were about to attend would suit beautifully, and that she wondered whether Catherine might consider, just for this one evening, allowing her to wear it instead. The request, delivered in the smooth, warm register of a woman making a casual suggestion between colleagues preparing for a shared occasion, had landed in the room with the specific weight of something that was not casual at all. Catherine had felt it. The dresser had felt it. Even the ladies in waiting, positioned at the edges of the room in the composed attendance that their role required, had felt the quality of the silence that followed the request before Catherine's response arrived. Catherine had said, with the particular brand of composed grace that she deployed when she needed to decline something in a context that did not permit the kind of direct refusal the situation actually warranted, that the piece had been prepared for the evening, and that changing the preparation at this stage would create difficulties for the coordination that had already been established. Camilla had smiled. She had said she understood completely. She had said she would not want to create any difficulties. And then, in the brief period of collective checking that followed, the mutual confirmation of readiness, the professional assessment of overall presentation, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that produced a visible confrontation or an audible exchange. But the tiara, when the gathering concluded and the movement toward the ceremony began, was no longer in the position where it had been prepared. It was in Camilla's hands. How it had come to be in Camilla's hands was a question that would occupy the subsequent hours with the particular intensity of institutional inquiries conducted in real time, before the dust of a situation had settled into the pattern that retrospective analysis could more clearly read. What the various accounts agreed on was this. In the brief, busy period of final preparation that preceded departure for the ceremony, in the controlled chaos of last adjustments and final confirmations that such periods always produced, the tiara had moved. The specific moment of its movement and the specific agency that had produced that movement were things that different people in the room would describe with slight but significant variations. The dresser's account emphasized a request made to a junior lady in waiting that had been understood as coming from a more senior authority than was later claimed. One of the ladies in waiting described a moment of apparent confusion about which piece was intended for which person that she had resolved in the direction of what she had believed was the more senior woman's preference. Another account suggested the tiara had been lifted from its position for closer examination and had not been returned before the moment of departure approached. What these variations shared was their description of a process that had not been transparent, that had not produced the kind of clear, consensual exchange that the transfer of a significant royal object from one person to another required. That had, in whatever specific form it had actually taken, resulted in an outcome that Catherine had not agreed to, and that the dresser had not been in a position to prevent before the room emptied for the ceremony. Catherine had understood what had happened before the ceremony began. She had not made a scene. She had not created a visible disruption in the moments before a significant public occasion where visible disruption would have produced consequences far beyond the immediate situation. She had absorbed what had happened with the composed control that royal life had given her, had made the alternative choices that the sudden absence of the prepared piece required, and had carried herself into the ceremony with the practiced grace that no one present would have read as anything other than the composure she had demonstrated across every significant occasion of her public life. But inside the composure, something very different was present. Not simply the practical frustration of a preparation disrupted, something deeper than that. The specific, clarifying anger of a person who had understood, in the clearest possible terms, that what had happened was not confusion or coincidence. It had been pressure. Applied in the smooth, deniable, institutionally difficult to name manner of someone who understood how these things worked and had used that understanding with precision. Anne learned of what had happened during the ceremony itself, not through any visible signal or disruptive communication. The occasion was too significant and too public for any such transmission. But through the quiet, efficient intelligence network that kept her informed of developments within the family's internal operations, even in contexts where direct communication was not possible. A note. Passed through the specific channel reserved for communications that needed to reach Anne without going through the institutional structures that would have delayed them or routed them through people whose discretion she did not fully trust for matters of this sensitivity. She read it in the composed manner. She read all significant information in public contexts, without visible reaction, without any change in her bearing or expression that the cameras or the observers around her could have registered as meaningful. She placed the note in the small clutch appropriate to the occasion and returned her attention to the ceremony proceeding around her. But what was happening inside the composure was the specific, focused anger of a woman who had spent decades watching certain patterns repeat themselves within the institution she had given her life to serving, who had intervened in those patterns when intervention was possible and necessary, who had built her understanding of when and how to intervene from exactly the kind of accumulated experience that this particular pattern was now drawing on. The ceremony concluded. The public portion of the occasion moved through its appointed sequence with the precision that significant royal ceremonies always produced. The photographs were taken. The appearances were made. The institution presented itself to the watching world with the composed unity that it was designed to project. And then the private portion of the evening arrived. Anne found Catherine in the brief window between the ceremony's conclusion and the formal dinner that followed. The window was narrow, 15 minutes, perhaps 20, in a private anteroom whose function was exactly this kind of compressed transition between the public occasion and the private one that followed it. She entered the room, confirmed it contained only Catherine and her senior dresser, and closed the door. She asked Catherine to tell her what had happened. Not what she had heard of, what had happened, what Catherine herself had experienced, from the moment Camilla had entered the dressing room to the moment the ceremony had begun. Catherine told her, with the directness and the completeness that Anne's manner of asking always produced. The specific quality of attention she brought to receiving accounts of significant events that communicated, clearly and without words, that she wanted the truth rather than the managed version of it. When Catherine finished, Anne was quiet for a moment. Then she said three things. The first was that what had happened was unacceptable, not in the institutional sense of violating a written protocol, though it had done that. In the human sense of having used pressure in a context where pressure was not a legitimate tool, the tiara had been Catherine's for the evening, prepared, coordinated, confirmed. The manner in which it had come to be in Camilla's possession was not, whatever specific form that manner had taken, a form that the institution could treat as within the ordinary range of the small adjustments and accommodations that shared occasions produced. The second was that the dresser who had been present needed to provide a written account of what she had witnessed, as specifically and completely as she could reconstruct it, and that account needed to be in Anne's office before the formal dinner concluded. The third was that Catherine should attend the dinner with the full composure and full presence that the occasion required, and that nothing visible should pass between her and Camilla during the evening that could be read by the people around them as indicating that anything other than the ordinary shared experience of a significant occasion had occurred. Catherine received all three things. She said she understood. Anne said she knew she did. She said she was sorry for what the morning had required Catherine to absorb and for what the evening was going to require her to continue absorbing. She said the situation would be addressed completely, and that addressed completely meant something specific. Not a conversation, not a carefully worded institutional communication, but a response that left no ambiguity about what had occurred and what the consequences for having allowed it to occur were going to be. Catherine looked at Anne. She said she trusted that. Anne said good. She opened the door and they both moved toward the formal dinner in the composed and unhurried manner that the occasion required. The dinner proceeded. For anyone observing the senior royal women from the outside, the guests, the staff, the subtle peripheral presence of the institution's communications professionals who monitored significant social occasions for the kinds of signals that required management, it was entirely unremarkable, the expected warmth, the appropriate conversation. The seamless performance of collegial ease that the women who had spent years sharing these occasions had refined to something that looked entirely natural because the effort required to produce it had been refined into invisibility. But between Anne and Camilla, in the specifically positioned moments when their sight lines intersected across the table, something was passing that had nothing to do with the surface of the evening. Anne's attention, when it found Camilla, had a quality that was different from attention in any ordinary sense. It was the quality of someone who had concluded something and was communicating that conclusion without the medium of words, in the specific register of two people who had known each other long enough to speak in registers that did not require language. Camilla felt it. She was too experienced, too finely attuned to the emotional atmospherics of rooms she shared with Anne, not to feel it. What she felt produced a slight but detectable change in her bearing. A careful straightening, a controlled elevation of the quality of composure she was projecting, as though the additional effort of appearing entirely at ease was necessary in a way that it had not been at the beginning of the evening. The tiara rested on her head through the dinner, perfectly positioned, perfectly maintained. The object of an incident that the room around her had no knowledge of, and that the woman across the table had decided, with characteristic precision, to address in the time and manner of her own choosing, rather than in the compressed and public space of the evening itself. The meeting Anne had requested was set for the following morning, 9 o'clock. The small conference room adjacent to her working office. A room that communicated, by its choice, that what was going to occur in it was formal without being ceremonial, institutional without being bureaucratic, the kind of space where things were said that needed to be said and heard in a way that made their being heard unambiguous. Camilla arrived at 9 o'clock with the punctuality that professional respect for Anne's time required. She was composed. She was dressed with the understated precision appropriate to a morning meeting rather than a public occasion. She carried herself with the measured confidence of someone who had decided, in the hours since the previous evening, that the posture she would bring to whatever was coming was one of settled authority rather than defensive uncertainty. Anne was already in the room when she arrived. She was seated, which was a choice, a deliberate departure from the standing, active manner she often maintained in working meetings, and a signal that what was going to happen in this room was going to proceed at a pace that she controlled rather than one that could be accelerated by the restless energy of standing engagement. She indicated the chair on the opposite side of the table. Camilla sat. Anne placed 2 documents on the table between them. The first was the dresser's written account, which had arrived in Anne's office before the dinner concluded, as requested. The second was a brief institutional summary that Anne's office had prepared. A clean, precise document describing the sequence of events from the preparation of the tiara to its appearance on Camilla's head at the ceremony, sourced from the dresser's account and cross-referenced with the corroborating details provided by 2 of the ladies-in-waiting who had also provided brief written accounts in the hours following the dinner. Anne said she wanted Camilla to read both documents before they spoke. She said she wanted the conversation that followed to begin from the same factual foundation, and that the documents represented the most complete and most carefully sourced account of that foundation currently available. Camilla read both documents. Her face, in the reading, maintained the composure she had brought into the room, though Anne, watching with the attention she brought to all things that mattered, registered the small changes that passed through the composure in response to specific sections of the dresser's account, the moments where the account was most precise. The moments where the description of what had occurred was most difficult to receive in silence. When Camilla finished, she placed the documents on the table. Anne spoke. She said that the accounts described an event that had 3 characteristics, all of which mattered, and none of which could be separated from the others without losing something essential to the full picture. The first was that Catherine had been placed in a position where pressure was applied in a manner that used her institutional relationship to the person applying it as the mechanism of the pressure. Not explicit coercion, not a demand. Something more sophisticated and more damaging than either of those. The implication, delivered through the manner of the request and the context in which it was made, that declining the request carried a cost that the request itself did not name, but that both parties understood. The second was that the object involved was not a neutral one. The tiara carried the institutional and personal associations that it carried, and those associations were known to everyone in the room where the exchange had taken place. Using an object of that specific significance as the subject of a pressure applied to a person with Catherine's specific position within the family was not separable from those associations. The choice of object was part of the act. The third was that the manner in which the tiara had ultimately moved from its prepared position to Camilla's possession, through a process that the accounts described as involving confusion, misdirected instruction, and the kind of institutional ambiguity that was difficult to challenge in the moment but impossible to defend in retrospect, had produced an outcome that could not be described as consensual. Regardless of how each individual step in the process was characterized, Anne said she wanted Camilla to respond to these 3 points, not to the documents, to the points, because the points were what the institutional response was going to need to address, and she needed to understand Camilla's account of them before she determined what the appropriate form of that response was. Camilla was quiet for a moment. In the silence, something in the quality of her composure shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that could be characterized as a fracture, but a settling, a movement from the defended posture she had brought into the room towards something more honest. She said the request had been a genuine one, that she had found the piece remarkable and had expressed that genuinely. She said she had not intended the manner of the expression to carry the pressure that the dresser's account suggested it had carried. Anne said she understood that intention and pressure were different things. That what a person intends to communicate and what the person in the position of receiving the communication experiences are not always equivalent. And that in situations where there is a structural imbalance between the person making a request and the person receiving it, the experience of the person receiving the request is the more reliable account of the request's actual character. Camilla received this. She received it in the silence of someone processing something that was both clear and uncomfortable. Then she said something that Anne had not expected her to say. She said she understood the point. She said that the structural realities of the positions she and Catherine occupied within the family were such that a request from her to Catherine, however genuinely intended, existed in a context that she had not fully accounted for. She said she had not thought carefully enough about what the request would feel like to receive in that context. And she said that the outcome, the tiara ending up in her possession through a process that Catherine had not explicitly agreed to, was something she could not defend, whatever the intentions that had preceded it. Anne looked at her for a long moment. Then she said that was a more honest response than she had anticipated, and that it changed the nature of the conversation they needed to have. She said the institutional response she had been preparing was structured around what she had expected the conversation to produce. A defense, a set of alternative characterizations of the events, a claim that the accounts were incomplete or misrepresentative. What Camilla had said instead changed the terrain. It did not eliminate the need for a response. What had happened and required address regardless of how honestly it was acknowledged afterward. But it changed the character of the response that was appropriate. She said the tiara would be returned to Catherine's custodianship that morning through a formal process that created a clear institutional record of the return. She said a brief internal communication would be circulated to the relevant household staff, confirming the appropriate process for the preparation and management of objects designated for specific members of the family on specific occasions. A communication that addressed the process without naming the incident, which protected the dignity of everyone involved while establishing the clarity the incident had shown was needed. And she said that a conversation between Camilla and Catherine was required, not managed through institutional channels, direct, personal. In the specific register of an honest exchange between two women who shared a family and a set of obligations, and whose ability to navigate both depended on a foundation of mutual respect that the previous day had damaged. Camilla said she was prepared for that conversation. Anne said she knew. She said the fact that she was prepared for it was the most useful thing the morning had produced. Catherine received Anne's account of the meeting in the mid-morning through a direct call that Anne made as soon as Camilla had left the conference room. The account was complete and precise, as Anne's accounts always were. It included Camilla's response, the honest acknowledgement, the absence of defense, the acceptance of what had occurred as something that could not be justified regardless of what had been intended. Catherine received this with the attention it deserved. When Anne finished, she said one thing before responding to any of the specifics. She said she was glad Anne had been the one to have that conversation. Not because she was incapable of having it herself, but because Anne's presence in that room had communicated something that her own presence would not have been able to communicate with the same clarity. That what had occurred was not simply a personal grievance between two women who shared a complicated relational space. It was an institutional matter, one that the institution took seriously enough to address at a level that made the seriousness visible. Anne said she thought that was right. She said the personal and the institutional were not separable in this case, but that giving the institutional dimension its proper weight was the only way to ensure that the personal dimension was also properly addressed. That treating it as purely personal, a misunderstanding between colleagues, something to be resolved through private conversation without institutional acknowledgement, would have left Catherine without the protection that the situation warranted and would have allowed the pattern, if it was a pattern, to continue without the structural resistance that institutional response provided. Catherine said she understood. She said she would speak with Camilla when the time was right. She said she did not want the conversation to be arranged too quickly. Not because she needed time to prepare herself for it, but because she wanted it to happen in a moment when both of them could bring their full honesty to it rather than the managed version of honesty that too much proximity to the incident produced. Anne said that was wise. Catherine said she had learned wisdom about the timing of difficult conversations from watching the people around her who handled them best. Anne said she was going to assume Catherine was not referring to her because she had told William the same thing and had found it uncomfortable then as well. Catherine said she was absolutely referring to her. Anne said she would choose to accept the compliment and move on, since arguing about it would waste time that both of them could better spend on other things. Catherine laughed, genuinely. It was, Anne thought, the most useful sound the morning had produced. The tiara was returned to Catherine's custodianship before noon, through the formal process Anne had described. The internal communication went out to the relevant household staff with the clarity and the institutional weight that such communications carried when they originated from Anne's office. The conversation between Catherine and Camilla happened 4 days later, in a private sitting room at Kensington that Catherine had chosen. Her own territory, which was itself a statement, though a quiet one, about where the ground of honest exchange between them needed to be established. What passed between them in that room was private in the complete sense. No aid, no witness, no institutional presence. Two women who had been navigating a complicated shared space for years, sitting across from each other with the specific material of a specific incident between them, working toward the kind of honest exchange that was the only foundation on which anything durable could be built. Camilla said what she had said to Anne, but said it differently in this room. Without the institutional formality that Anne's presence had required, in the more personal register that Catherine's presence and Catherine's space made possible. She said she had not considered what the request felt like to receive. She said that failure of consideration was something she owned completely. Catherine said she heard that. She said she had spent the days since the incident working through the difference between the act and the intention, and that she had arrived at a place where she could hold both at once. Understand that the intention had been genuine, while also understanding that the effect had been what it had been. She said she wanted one thing from the conversation, not an apology in the formal sense. The acknowledgement Camilla had offered was sufficient for that purpose. She wanted an understanding. A shared understanding of the specific territory that was Catherine's within the family's symbolic and institutional architecture, and of the importance of that territory being respected not occasionally but consistently. Camilla said she understood that. She said she would honor it. Catherine said she trusted that. She said it in the way she said things she genuinely meant, without elaboration, without the supplementary language that performs sincerity, without feeling it. The conversation found its end in the natural way that honest conversations found their ends. Not with resolution in any dramatic sense, but with the arrival of a point where everything that needed to be said had been said, and the space that remained was simply the space of two people having reached the end of something difficult together. Anne received a 2-word message from Catherine that evening. It went well. Anne read it. She set her phone down. She returned to the work that had been waiting while the morning's events had unfolded into the afternoon and evening. She did not reply immediately, because the message did not require immediate reply. She replied later that night with 3 words. Good. Move forward. Which was, for Anne, the fullest possible expression of everything she felt about the situation, the outcome, and the people who had navigated both. The tiara was in its proper place. The institution had addressed what needed addressing. The people involved had found their way, through the imperfect and costly process that honest engagement with difficult things always required, to something more stable than what the morning of the incident had produced. It was not perfect. It never was. But it was real. And real, inside a family that spent so much of its existence managing the performance of things rather than the substance of them, was the most valuable outcome available. Anne had done what the situation required. The palace was steadier for it. And the tiara, resting in its proper custodianship, was simply what it had always been. An object whose value was not in its material, but in the meaning that the people around it had agreed to give it. Meaning that now, after everything the incident had required to protect, was more clearly understood by everyone who mattered. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.